All right, hello everybody. I'm Kaylynn Stookbury, Outreach Archivist here at the Russell Library. Welcome to the inaugural Food, Power, and Politics lecture, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, the University of Georgia Libraries, and the College of Family and Consumer Sciences at UGA. Founded in 1974 at the University of Georgia, the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies preserves the papers, archival records, and material culture of individuals and organizations documenting politics, public policy, and the modern history of Georgia. Our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Marion Nestle. I'm sure she needs no introduction since you're here with us, but Dr. Nestle is a consumer advocate, nutritionist, and author of 6 award-winning books, including Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health, along with Soda Politics, Taking Big Soda and Winning. Her research examines the scientific and socioeconomical influences on food choice, obesity, and food safety, with an emphasis on the role of food marketing. Among her numerous prestigious awards, Dr. Nestle is the recipient of the John Dewey Award for Distinguished Public Service from Bard College and the Public Health Hero Award from the University of California at Berkeley's School of Public Health. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nestle.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. I just wish I could be there in person, giving this lecture under these very strange circumstances. I have a slide presentation, so I'm going to make an attempt to share the screen.
Okay.
And with a little luck, my technological prowess will work.
Okay, and I'm going to hide myself while Dr. Nestle gives her presentation. And just so everyone knows, after her remarks today, we're going to go into a Q&A session. So my colleagues are going to be monitoring the questions in chat portal. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your webinar screen to submit your questions. And then at the end, I will be delivering some of those questions so we can learn more. All right, I'm going to go away. So take it off.
Well, hello, everybody. I write books about food politics. That's what I do. And here's the collection of books that have come out since the year 2002, when food politics first appeared. My most recent book came out about 6 weeks ago. It's called Let's Ask Marion What You Need to Know About the Politics of Food, Nutrition, and Health. And I was asked today to talk about the intersection of nutrition and food politics and what's new in nutrition and food politics. And that's exactly what this book is about. The book is quite unusual in my collection because, for one thing, it's really small. It's a tiny little book, 4 by 6 inches, not much bigger than a coffee cup. I wrote it to be readable by absolutely everybody. And it's a question and answer format book with a friend of mine named Carrie Truman, who asks very sophisticated questions in little mini essays, and then I answered them in somewhat longer essays. And there are 18 questions, and 6 each about personal diets, community diets, and global diets, and how food politics affects them. We wrote this book before the coronavirus pandemic hit, but I was reading the page proofs for the book in April, and there was a blank page. So I got to at least say something about it. And what I said was that COVID-19 essentially displayed the exact kinds of things that I was talking about in that book. In devastating lives, livelihoods, and economies, COVID-19 has exposed all of the contradictions and inequities of what we have today, which are profit-driven economic healthcare and food systems. And the pandemic has illustrated the book's themes, and the major themes are pretty straightforward. Our food system has a lot of flaws. Food is very political in every possible way, and it's critical to do advocacy for healthier and more sustainable food systems. So food systems is the first new concept that I think is, I mean, it's not new this minute, but it's new in the last several years, where we're now talking about nutrition, not only in terms of nutrients, but also in terms of the system that supplies those nutrients. Food system refers to everything that happens to a food from the time it's grown, processed, distributed, bought, prepared, eaten, and wasted. And food system thinking is really important because it links agriculture to food, nutrition, public health, and to the environment. And the point of it is that you can't really talk about one part of this without talking about all of the other parts, or at least thinking about all of the other parts at the same time. So this requires some complexity, but I think it's really valuable. And the point about food systems is that global food system problems in 2020 involve dysfunctional food systems, affect food systems, and are affected by them. And these problems are hunger and food insecurity, which affects more than 1 billion people in the world, obesity and the chronic diseases for which it's a risk factor, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so forth, that affect at least 2, maybe more billion people. The environmental effects of the way we grow and the way we raise and consume food affect absolutely everybody. And now we have the COVID-19 pandemic to worry about. And all of these are related to food systems. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrates flaws in the food system, how important it is to eat healthfully, how important socioeconomic factors are in determining health, the politics of hunger, what's happening with low-wage workers in our society, how our government has been captured by corporations, and all of this sets an agenda for food advocacy. And I'll say just a little bit about each of these. Starting with food systems, the first thing that happened was we didn't have any food in supermarkets. We have plenty of food in this country. How did that happen? Well, we have 2 completely separate supply chains for food, one for retail, supermarkets and grocery stores and convenience stores, and the other restaurants, school feeding, institutional feeding, 2 completely separate supply chains done in completely separate ways, and so rigidly separated that that the food service supply chain, which was blocked, couldn't feed into the retail chain. I think most people didn't know that. I certainly didn't understand that as clearly as I do now. Second obvious point, the people most vulnerable to severe effects of COVID-19 are those who have pre-existing conditions. Obesity, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. These are related to diet. Diet is really important to health. So it pointed up that. Social determinants of health are extremely important and interrelated. And these include race, gender, class issues, access, socioeconomic status, educational status, what your community's strength and cohesion. These affect the chronic diseases that are related to diet, diabetes, high blood pressure, and so forth. They affect obesity, and these have been observed to be important in causing severe outcomes from COVID-19. And then here's Chef Jose Andres with a tweet pointing up what I think was the most amazing contradiction of what happened during the pandemic. On the one hand, we had, because of the supply chain problems, potato growers, milk producers, animal producers having to destroy what they had produced because there was no place for it to go, while we had people lined up in automobiles for miles waiting for handouts from food banks. Something wrong with this picture, a food system problem. And looking at the overall situation, particularly in meatpacking plants, It turns out that low-wage workers, often without health care benefits, often without sick leave benefits, some of the poorest paid and most badly treated workers in the United States, suddenly deemed essential despite enormous caseloads. And the Leah Douglas of the Food and Environment Reporting Network, who is the only person I know who's tracking these things, said there have been nearly 72,000 cases among these workers so far and more than 300 deaths. So suddenly, meatpacking has become a really dangerous problem. And it's easy to understand what the problem is. These people are crowded together, working under very close, unmasked conditions. Even though health authorities wanted to close them down, the president intervened and invoked the Defense Production Act to keep the meat plants open, despite the fact that people were getting ill and dying. And now we have emails that were obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests that show that the meatpacking companies, the Tysons and the JBSs and the Smithfields of our world, were involved in drafting the executive order that the president signed, and that the Department of Agriculture and the meatpacking industry collaborated, colluded, if you like it, to undermine the meat industry's response to the COVID pandemic, putting the workers greatly at risk. So that's on the one side. On the other side, we have all those cars lined up to get handouts at food banks, something that made the cover of the New York Times Magazine in April. And this was also ironic because we have millions of people who are complaining that they don't have enough food to eat. They're what we consider food insecure. They don't have a reliable source of food, with stark racial and economic disparities as families are trying to just feed their families. And the reasons for this are pretty obvious. Lots of people lost their jobs. When restaurants closed and institutions closed, people were out of work. Initial claims for unemployment insurance peaked in April and have gone down since, but there's still 750,000 people every week applying for unemployment insurance. Nobody keeps very good data on the number of unemployed Americans, but the figure is somewhere between 20 and 50 million. I know that's a very big range, but whatever it is, there are lots and lots of people who are out of work and are needing to find money to pay for food and to pay their rent and pay everything else they have to pay. So we have a very, very difficult situation under this pandemic. One thing that was helpful was food stamps, and 6 million more people enrolled in food stamps in the months between February and July. So the food stamps are an entitlement program. Anybody who could qualify on the basis of income and assets can get food stamps. It's now called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it gives you a credit card that you can take to a grocery store and buy what you need until the money runs out. Well, one of the other ironies of all of this is that the Trump administration has been doing everything it can since 2018 to reduce enrollments on SNAP. And those efforts have taken there have been three ways in which they've tried to do that. One is to introduce work requirements, whether there are jobs or not. There are people required to work or they don't get the benefits. The second is by invoking the public charge rule, which is a rule that said that any immigrant who comes into the United States and gets public benefits of any kind whatsoever then becomes ineligible for getting a green card or citizenship and becomes susceptible to deportation. And that rule has been responsible for a lot of people not applying for SNAP benefits, even if they're qualified. And then the third way was to replace the SNAP credit card with boxes of food that would be given out through distributors. Now, the courts have blocked the first two. The courts have said that the Trump administration cannot implement the work rule until the COVID pandemic is over with. So that one's on hold. And a federal judge just blocked the administration from implementing the public charge rule, but that's now been overturned by another judge. That happened yesterday. And so these things are being fought out in the courts. We have the Farmers to Families Food Box program, about $4.5 million, $4.5 billion, has been put into that. And the way this was supposed to work was that farmers' excess produce that they couldn't sell would be picked up by distributors and then taken to private food banks, and the food banks would distribute boxes of food to families. A very cumbersome logistic system that has been very heavily criticized as paying too much for food that shouldn't cost taxpayers as much as it's costing, and not getting the food to the people who need it most. Someone is profiting off of this, says The Counter, which is a website that tracks these kinds of things. They looked at public records showing that the contractors get far more money for boxes that aren't really very good. And people don't have a choice about what's in them. So this program is not working as well as it was advertised as working. So we have to ask the question, can anything good come out of the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm a glass half full kind of person. I like to see if there are good things coming out of it. And there is some evidence that COVID-19 is making millions of Americans healthier. Who knew? But a lot of that has to do with the shutdown inspiring people to do their own cooking, not eating out so much. For people who could cook and like to cook and are willing to cook, the food that they're cooking at home is probably healthier than what they were getting before. But this is only people who can cook, can afford to cook, and have the equipment to cook. Other research is showing that butter is back, and that butter sales are booming, and that if any of you were anxious about the election, you were probably one of many people who sought out junk food and booze as the election results trickled in. So there's a big question about what it is that people are eating and whether in fact they're eating healthfully. And I think this is a problem in general. Americans are confused about food. They don't know where to turn for answers. I, of course, when I'm asked, where do you turn for answers, say, well, me, of course. And my latest book. But the confusion is really too bad, because I think that dietary advice is very, very simple. And it is so simple that the journalist Michael Pollan can do it in 7 words. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. So not too much and mostly plants, you can kind of get. Eat your veggies, don't overeat. Eat food requires a definition. And I want to say something about the definition of food, because I think this is another new concept in nutrition that is extremely important and that ought to make nutritionists' lives much easier. And that is the concept of ultra-processed foods. The definition of ultra-processed foods, which I'll give you next, distinguishes ultra-processed foods from minimally processed and processed foods. Michael Pollan would define food as something that is unprocessed, minimally processed, or processed, but not ultra-processed. Okay. What's ultra-processed? Ultra-processed, a term dreamed up by Carlos Monteiro, who's a public health professor at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, defines ultra-processed foods as those that are industrially produced. You can't make them in home kitchens. They have no obvious relation to the food from which they were derived. They have loads of additives that add color, flavor, and texture, preservatives, a lot of added salt, sugar, and calories. They're very heavily marketed, and they are extremely profitable. They're the most profitable foods for food industry marketers. There is now a vast amount of evidence that ultra-processed people who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods do not have good health outcomes. There have been hundreds of papers using the term ultra-processed since 2009, which is when Montero first introduced the term. And there are now, and those hundreds of papers document how the consumption of ultra-processed diets is associated with obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, depression, I don't know, okay, and all-cause mortality, as well as COVID-19. There's now just ample evidence for all of that. Now, those are associations, and for those of you who are research critics, you know that association doesn't mean causation, but there is one clinical trial that does demonstrate causation. And this was a clinical trial done last year by Kevin Hall and his colleagues at the Diabetes Institute at the National Institute of Health, where he, in a controlled metabolic ward, got 20 people to volunteer, and for 2 weeks they ate ultra-processed diets, and for 2 weeks they ate diets that were minimally unprocessed or just somewhat processed. And when they were on the ultra-processed diets, and the diets were matched in nutrients, flavor, a lot of other qualities. When they were on the ultra-processed diets, they ate 500 calories a day more than when they were on the processed or unprocessed diet. So there's something about ultra-processing of foods that makes people eat more, and the people who were in this trial did not realize they were eating 500 calories a day more. 500 calories is a lot. It's really a lot. They gained a pound a week and gained 2 pounds over the 2 weeks they were on that diet. So something very important is going on here. Kevin Hall and his colleagues are studying what that something is. They don't really know at the moment. But from the standpoint of nutritional advice, it makes our work much easier. Avoid ultra-processed foods. One more thing that I think is really important, and that's new, and that is the idea of looking at food insecurity, obesity, and the environmental problems, and COVID-19 for that matter, as all part of the same food system problem, and devising actions to prevent those problems that cover all of them. And 2 reports in the journal, the British journal, The Lancet, last year, early in 2019, discussed the kind of diet that would address all of those problems and how to go about getting that diet. And they called them triple duty actions, or syndemic. Syndemic was the word they used to refer to multiple pandemics. A food system approach to dietary advising. And their advice was completely consistent with Michael Pollan's eat food, not too much, mostly plants. For healthy people and a healthy planet, they advised eating more vegetables, eating less meat, and minimizing consumption of ultra-processed foods. Look how simple that is. Look how deliciously you can eat within those kinds of guidelines. I think it makes nutrition much, much easier, and much easier for people to understand. And that's what we all should be advocating for. I'm greatly in favor of food advocacy. I think it's an important thing to do for democracy. People get food advocacy. It's a terrific way to talk to people about the kind of changes that we need to make in order to get a food system and diets that promote the health of people and promote the health of the planet all at the same time. And to do that, we need not only to vote with our votes, which I hope you all did, and also voting with your vote means to get involved in politics, and then also to make your own personal food choices by voting for the kind of food system that you want, by voting with your fork. But you need to do both, and you need to do both at the same time. And if I had one wish, it would be to turn you all into food advocates. Get out there, join organizations, engage with the political system, and please run for office. I'll stop here and turn it over to whoever I'm turning it over to. But I really thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. And as I said, I just wish I could be there in person.
Thank you so much for that. That was great. And we wish you could be here in person with us as well. But this is our, we're all getting used to the Zoom now, I think.
Right.
Okay, so before we jump into some of the audience questions, I have one question here from the Russell Library. So here at the library, we have lots of items in our collections related to the National School Lunch Program. So when Senator Russell sponsored the establishment of the National School Lunch Program back in 1947, his rationale for doing so was to give a steady market for farmers' crops and also to give American children access to regular meals. So if you are writing this legislation today or considering legislation like this, what would you emphasize?
I would start with universal school meals so that children have breakfast and lunches, no questions asked. All children, all schools get breakfast and lunch. That would be the starting position. And that because what we discovered during the COVID pandemic was that schools aren't only about teaching. They're about feeding kids, and all of a sudden, families that were absolutely dependent on school meals for feeding their kids didn't have them, and the schools had to work out some kind of arrangement, and the Department of Agriculture permitted them to have universal school meals supplied until June of 2021. We need to continue that program beyond June of 2021. So that's the starting position. Then we can get clever about farm to school programs on a local level. One of the things that I've observed about school meals is that even though there are national standards for what has to be in those meals, the implementation of those standards is extremely local and dependent on who the people are. In the schools, I can walk into a school, and if the staff knows the names of the kids, and if they're cooking the meals from scratch, the food's probably going to be pretty good and the kids are going to be eating it. But there are lots of programs that don't do that. And if there are people in the school who care about what kids eat and think it's really important for kids to eat healthfully, the food will be good and the kids will be eating it. So I think linking schools to farms is just a great idea. If you have local farms that can do that, it requires some logistics, but there are plenty of schools that are doing it. There are plenty of schools that have garden programs. Alice Waters in Berkeley had this idea that sounded crazy when she suggested it. Let's have a garden in school and teach kids how to plant food, grow food, prepare food, eat food, understand food. These programs are fabulous. I've seen a lot of them in some of the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, for example, where there are kids who are eating salads. They think eating greens is just a great thing to do. They grew those greens. So I'm in favor of all of that. I think there's plenty we could do.
Yeah, actually in Clark County, some of the schools have garden programs where they learn about the vegetables and use them in cooking here locally in Athens. So that's great. I have a few questions from the audience. I have a question from Sabina. So our current high yield food system allow the population of the planet to skyrocket. How would a reformed, more sustainable system that would be more organic and less high yield in the absence of pesticides affect world population numbers? Could a reformed system sustain the population?
Well, that, of course, is the rationale that's used by industrial agriculture to fight any kind of change. Most of the research that I've seen, we would have to eat less meat. Let's start with that, because much of the land that's used for growing food is being used to grow corn and soybeans to feed cattle, or being grown for corn to fuel automobiles with ethanol. 40% of the United States corn is used for ethanol. I can't get my head around that. It makes absolutely no sense to me at all. I'm sorry if you're in the ethanol production business, but it makes no sense to me at all. So right away, we have enormous amounts of land where we can grow food. The production of food through sustainable agriculture is not as efficient as industrial agriculture, but it's almost as efficient. So if we were eating less meat and more vegetables, I think we could do just fine. And the issue of population control, which is something that nobody ever talks about because it's so fraught with political and religious overtones, population takes care of itself if people have enough money. If people are well enough off economically, they don't need to produce large numbers of children to take care of them in their old age. The populations tends to go down. That's what happened in Europe, where the European birth rate is so low that they're not replacing their population. So large population growth mainly occurs in places where people don't have any money. So a different kind of agricultural system would take care of people better.
Great. We have another question from the audience. Audience is kind of switching gears to some of the questions here. Is there a member of Congress who you think has done a good job of food advocacy?
Shelley Pingree, Rosa DeLauro, and McGovern from Massachusetts are people who have been involved in hunger or food issues. They have a group of congressional representatives that they work with. I spoke to it once, which is how I know about it. They're in a minority. Whether the new majority will the new Congress will have people in it who join them, I don't know. But certainly there are people there who know these issues very well, are working on these issues, and are doing everything they can to try to develop a food system that's better for people and the planet.
So another audience question, I think this question's from Josh. He asks, what immediate actions can the incoming Biden administration take to change the operation of the food stamps program in a positive way?
Well, he can immediately undo the work requirement and public charge issues. That could be done. That was done by executive fiat, so it can be undone by executive fiat. The food stamp program is the only thing that's left of food assistance programs that reaches anybody at all. And we're in a situation now where unemployment benefits are running out. I just don't know what people are doing. If they don't have jobs, if there's no possibility that they're going to be employed, and the benefits are all running out at the end of this year. So one of the things that the administration will have to do is to figure out what to do about all those people, and how to extend the benefits and how to develop a work program that pays people. That's what happened during the Depression of the 1930s, was that the government developed the work projects administration, which hired vast numbers of people to build roads, build bridges. Those are the roads and bridges that we're still using, the ones that are falling apart now. We have a lot of I love the word, infrastructure to do in the United States. It would be nice if the government paid people to do that. And that would be a long-term commitment for things that the country needs really badly. Jobs.
So kind of a follow-up question that some other folks have been putting in the Q&A is, beyond food stamps, what are some food policies the incoming administration could focus on or focus on improving?
Well, I think that the number one priority has to be to make sure that everybody has enough to eat. So that means shoring up the food stamp program and the school lunch program so that people get fed. That's absolutely number one priority. Then after that, we start looking at what can we do to create an agricultural system that promotes the health of people and the environment. How we change our agricultural subsidy system so that we're subsidizing food for people, not feed for animals and fuel for cars. Those are big ones. And the first thing that Biden needs to do is to appoint people to federal agencies who want to build those agencies into the kinds of enterprises that promote the health of people and the planet. The agencies have been severely damaged over the last 4 years, and they need to be replenished. So who the president-elect appoints to head those major food agencies seems really important. In the long run, I'd like to see a single food agency that coordinated the functions of not only the Department of Agriculture and the FDA, but also the other agencies that deal with food issues. I talk about this in my book, Let's Ask Marion, and have a chart of all the different agencies that are dealing with food issues. There are a lot of them. I mean, there's plenty that could be done if there were political will to do it.
So on a little bit of a lighter note here, we have another question. Someone asked a question. I think this is from Annie. Besides yourself, obviously, what authors or books do you consider essential nutrition reading?
Essential nutrition reading. I'm almost not reading anything in nutrition these days. I'm reading about food systems. I think food systems thinking is essential for people to understand how the world works and why it is that it's so difficult to advise people to eat better and get them to actually eat better. They would eat better if they could. They can't. And so we need to change the food system to make the healthy choice the easy choice, the cheaper choice, and just create a food system that makes it easier for everybody to have access to healthy food and to eat it and figure out what to do with it. And this involves, I think we need to get money out of politics. We need to change Wall Street so that Wall Street doesn't insist that corporations make profits every quarter, and that corporations are required in some way to take social values into consideration in how we evaluate corporations. I mean, these are I think nutrition relates to all of this. And if you don't understand these other things and how the system is working, you can't really be effective as a nutrition counselor because you're not dealing with the reality of people's lives.
To follow up on how you were talking about corporatization and corporations and making profits, we have a question from Austin that kind of addresses this. He was asking, or she was asking, as we begin to address existing problems as well as new problems, how do we prevent the continued corporatization of our food systems as we move forward? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the 2 Lancet reports that I referred to in my talk address that question, particularly the Global Syndemic Report, which I think is one of the most important reports ever written, by the way. I mean, that's why I'm talking about it. I think everybody should read it. It's not easy reading. It's 50 pages of very tiny print, but it makes some points that are absolutely essential. The reason that we have the problems that we do are because of weak government. We have weak government. We have weak civil society. Civil society is not demanding that we have a better food system. And we have a very strong food industry. And so the obvious solution to that is to put some curbs on the food industry. First of all, it's to strengthen civil society. I'm really interested in strengthening civil society. I think everybody should be joining advocacy groups, and advocacy groups should be forming coalitions. And everyone should be looking at our food system and trying to fix it, because we have a big crisis that we're facing. It's called climate change. Whether you believe in it or not, it exists. And it's just an enormous crisis from the standpoint of food, because it's going to make it difficult to grow food in the way and raise food in the way we've been doing it. And there's already an enormous amount of research that higher carbon dioxide levels are going to reduce the nutritional quality of the foods that are being produced. So we've got a big change, big crisis with this. We have to deal with it. And if we don't have civil society demand, politicians won't do anything, because the way the election system works is the corporations pay them. So they're working for corporations. The only way that I see this changing is to have enormous civil demand for change. And that means organizing, community organizing, classic social movement. Everybody should take courses in social movements. Should be required for dietetic licensure.
So I actually have a question from Kari, who you met earlier today. She says, thank you so much for a great talk, Marion. I love for our students to know that our paths to success are not always perfect. Can you share one of your greatest career highlights and one of your greatest lessons learned?
First of all, Carrie, thank you very much for organizing that previous session. I was very impressed with that wheel. I loved it. I don't know. I mean, the things that I'm probably proudest of is the creation of food studies as a field of study at NYU. We just had a lucky break in my home economics department at NYU. We had to change it because nobody was taking home economics anymore. And we had an opportunity to create a program in food studies, not science, studies, sort of humanities program. And we took that, and we were the first food studies program in the country. There was one in gastronomy at Boston University, but I didn't think gastronomy would work in academic institutions. Food studies work much better. And now there are programs all over the world. So there are probably 60 or 70 food studies programs throughout the world now. So that's kind of exciting. It's pretty unusual to get to create a field of study. And we wanted to create the program that we wished we could have taken when we were undergraduates, a program that synthesizes nutrition, food, public health, agriculture, brings it all together. Very much a food systems approach to looking at food from a humanity, and brings the science in. I mean, I'm trained in basic science, and I use it all the time, but not everybody does. But it brings together these kinds of things. So that to me was probably the highlight. Have there been, I'm not quite sure what Carrie is asking. The reason that I got involved in food politics was because I went to a meeting at the National Cancer Institute in the early 1990s that was about behavioral causes of cancer. Most of the speakers were anti-smoking advocates. They were physicians or academics who ran anti-smoking programs, and they showed slides of cigarette marketing throughout the world. And in particular, I remember, I'll never forget one presentation on cigarette marketing to children. Now, I knew that cigarettes were bad for health, and I knew that cigarette companies marketed to children, but I never paid any attention to it. It was just part of the landscape. It was just there. And I walked out of that meeting thinking, food marketing is just like cigarette marketing. Food is the same as cigarettes, but the marketing is the same. And the marketing aimed at children is the same. And we should be doing the same kind of advocacy against that kind of marketing that the anti-smoking advocates are doing for cigarettes. And that was really what started it, and that was the genesis of my book, Food Politics.
A follow-up question to that, there's two questions that are standing out to me in the chat that kind of go off this. So one of them is, as the founders of the food studies field, where do you think the field is moving, and where do you really see it going in the next 10 years or so?
Oh boy, everybody wants to know that question. It's an enormous question in the field right now. It's 25 years. So it's, it's got lots of graduates and they're all over the place doing all kinds of things. And one of the big issues in the field right now, being debated in the pages of the journal Gastronomica, is where the field is going, how to define it. It has factions. It's developed, it's maturing. It's got factions, it's got sects, it's got, people who are doing very, very different kind of work. It's interdisciplinary, which is always very difficult for academic institutions. Very, very difficult to run interdisciplinary programs. And so I don't know the answer to that question. I can just say it's something that's under intense debate right now.
Let's see. Haley Paxton has asked, you had mentioned advocacy groups in a few of your answers to questions. They're wondering, are there any particular groups that you follow or that you would recommend to someone that's interested to learn more on these topics?
Well, it depends on what you're interested in. Every nutrition student should be subscribing to Nutrition Action Health Letter from the Center for Science in the Public Interest. It's only $15 a year. And that is a 45-year-old advocacy group on nutrition issues. They lobby in Congress, they do position papers. It's the biggest game in town. It's Washington based. And I think, it's really easy to support them for $15 a year. It's not very much. And they're worth supporting. So that's sort of an obvious one. Beyond that, it depends on what issue you're interested in. And there are thousands and literally thousands of organizations. Very hard to keep track of them. There's more than 100 in New York City alone. A group called Food Tank is kind of responsible for trying to bring together organizations, and they publish lists of organizations that are working on different topics, and you can go to the Food Tank website and take your pick. You want to do something local, type in Food Advocacy Athens, Georgia, and see what pops up. I'm willing to bet that there are pages of groups in your town that are working on one kind of food issue or another. You have to figure out what the issue is that drives you and get involved in that one.
So let's see, Paula, she says she doesn't have a comment or a question so much as a comment. She says, we need a framework convention for food, and asks, what do you say to that?
Well, that's what one of those Lancet reports asked for. Global Syndemic Report called for a framework convention on food. And the reason for that was the United Nations framework conventions were very important in galvanizing international attention to those issues. So I think that's well worth working toward. I mean, it's very distressing to me that the United States pulled out of the World Health Organization. The United Nations is flawed, but it's the only way in which international countries can get together and talk about common issues. And I think that anything that brings the world together is worth working on. So I'm for it. I thought it was a really good suggestion.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question from Melanie, and I think she's a healthcare provider. Although policy change is important for getting fresh produce to areas, with the message that we healthcare providers should recommend minimally or lower processed foods and mostly plants, how can we balance that message with what is currently available, which is fewer fresh options and limited resource communities?
Yeah, I mean, you run the risk of sounding elitist if you're recommending diets, but I think poor people should have access to healthy diets too. This is a political issue. There's a reason why if you look at Department of Commerce data from 1980 to the present, the Department of Commerce shows that the price of all foods across the board has increased since 1980. but the price of fresh fruits and vegetables, and even other kinds of fruits and vegetables, has increased much higher than the average price of food. And the price of ultra-processed foods has increased at a much lower rate than the price of all kinds of foods. Those are political issues. There are reasons why ultra-processed foods are so cheap. There are reasons why fruits and vegetables are so expensive. They're labor intensive. They're not, they're perishable. They have to be transported. They have to be kept cold. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons for that. And here again, this is a place where government policy could have a very big impact. Intervene in that one. What can we as a nation do to make fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, cheaper, more accessible, fresher, more available to people who don't have a lot of resources? I think there's lots of things. I can think of lots of ways to do that. The main, the Trump administration put more than $50 billion over and above the amount of money that's in the Farm Bill into supporting corn and soybean farmers in the Midwest. The corn and soybeans go to feed animals or fuel for automobiles. That's a political decision. And so it's a question of political will and of civil society complaining enough, using the political system to try to encourage a different kind of approach to food.
Right. So you talk, this is kind of a follow-up again to how some folks were asking about the privatization and corporatization of parts of the food system. So Andrea asks, what role or roles are the private sector best equipped to fill in the U.S. food system, and which are best left to the public sector or government?
Well, the food industry has one goal. And only one goal. So whatever their decisions are, it's easy for them to make decisions because their decisions have to be profit-based. That's the way the Wall Street assesses them. It's what their stockholders expect. They're supposed to put stockholders first. We could insist that corporations take on social values. They're enormously well equipped to prevent waste, to prevent climate change, to try to produce food more sustainably and safely. There are lots and lots of things they could do. They don't get rewarded for that. In fact, they get rewarded for producing profits for shareholders, and that's their purpose. They're not public health agencies, and they can't be expected to be. So if we want food companies to produce healthier food, and to focus on healthier food, we have to set up a system of incentives for that, or require them to put social values and community values as part of their evaluation system in determining what their stock prices are. And that requires government, and it requires a government that's not already captured by corporations.
So we have a follow-up question to your discussion of anti-smoking marketing. And let's see, I don't know the name. Someone would like you to address the addictive aspects of processed foods and what kind of interventions do you see that are needed so that people learn to love healthy food?
Yeah, I don't like to use the word addiction for food. Food is something that we need every day. It's a requirement. It's not optional. You can't live if you don't eat. You have to have food to live. And so it's in a different category than cigarettes, alcohol, or opioid drugs, which are discretionary. Food is not discretionary. So I don't like the word addiction, but lots of people feel that they are addicted to one food or another. And my understanding of the addiction literature is that if people feel they are addicted, they are addicted. And that's, or, you know, you can define it any way you want to, but they need to be treated the way you would treat anyone who has an addiction problem. You know, you send them to a 12-step program or whatever you're going to do. The food industry, and this is Michael Moss's book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, documents how food companies formulate junk food products in order to make people love them. You know, there was this potato chip advertisement, you can't eat just one. That's the whole point. You can't eat just one. And that was what Kevin Hall's experiment showed so brilliantly, was that people eat 500 calories a day more when they're fed these things and they don't even know it. They're completely unaware of it. No wonder everybody gained weight. So the purpose of making these foods taste the way they do, crunch the way they do, have the color, texture, feel, smell, whatever, is to get people to eat more of them, because the purpose of these products is to sell them. So you want to change that system, you have to change some things.
Okay, and I think we have time for, let's see, one more question here at the end. And I think people would like you to talk a bit about pet food instead of human food, since you have a book on that as well. I think everyone loves their pets. So let's see, the question is, what is your take on some of the latest trends in the pet food industry? Things like the raw diet and grain-free trends, are those trends based on science, or are they just more marketing ploys?
I have a book called Feed Your Pet Right. It's a terrible title, an absolutely terrible title. It's 10 years old, but the book discusses all of those issues, and it's out of print, which means you can go on Amazon and buy it for the shipping charge, 1 penny over the shipping charge. It's a fun book. I had a wonderful time doing it with my partner, who was an animal nutritionist. We had a really good time doing it. I think pet food trends are hilarious. I love walking through the supermarket aisles that sell pet food, because the things that they're selling are so funny. Some of them are not good for pets. When they took the grains out of pets, there was probably an they don't know, but there's probably an amino acid problem. And it's, you know, pets are like everybody else. They need a variety of different kinds of foods. What the pet food industry did, and I want to say the pet food industry serves an extremely important function, and that is it accounts for a substantial proportion of wasted food in the United States. It absorbs an enormous amount of wasted food. And the wasted food is not junk, it's not bad. It's the parts of animals that we don't eat, it's parts of plants that humans don't eat. I was once in a fish factory in Alaska, where I saw these fish bones that had loads and loads and loads of salmon in between. I said, what's going to happen to all that? There was a lot of meat on those bones, and they said that it was going to pet food. So it's good stuff. It's just the waste of human food production. And we calculated that the amount of, that if you fed human food to pets, it would be like feeding another 150 million people in the United States. And so this is a lot of pets. So that can't be right. 40 or 50 million people, something like that, some enormous number of people. So pet food serves an enormous function. On the marketing side, pets don't buy the food. Humans buy the food. So all of the same marketing techniques that are used to try to convince people that the food is healthy for you and has some special health benefits, they use exactly the same kind of techniques on pet foods. Pets don't care. Dogs don't care what they eat, or most dogs don't care what they eat. They'll eat anything. And the foods are designed to sell to pet parents. is what they're called. It's designed to sell to humans. So it has to, and it's very hard to do because you need a product that smells disgusting enough to be attractive to a dog or a cat, but is not so disgusting that it turns off the person who's opening the can. And pet food is like baby food, or like it's like infant formula, in that there's one product that meets an animal's needs. Very convenient for people. Whether that's the best way to feed pets, we can argue about. But I think the idea that it takes up a lot of the food waste is a good reason for taking it seriously.
It's great. I think I'm sure a lot of people will be interested to pick up that book as well and learn more, because I think a lot of folks on this probably love their pets very much, and we're seeing a lot more of them these days.
Oh, yes. We love our pets.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. This wraps up our time, and I'm sorry we still had some of those. We had more questions in the chat, but we're out of time. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I think we've all learned so much more from hearing you speak today, and we're so happy that you were willing to serve as our inaugural speaker for our Food, Power, and Politics lecture series.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. So have a good afternoon, everyone, and go pick up some of Dr. Nestle's wonderful books to learn more. Thank you.